Climate scientists have a clear message. Our world must be at net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius warming will cause irreversible damage to the planet. But what do they mean by net zero? Put simply, it means do our best, remove the rest. Here's a short explanation. The world currently emits some 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, science says that in 2050, the global CO2 emissions would have to be at zero. So first of all, we need to double down on our efforts to reduce emissions. Do our best. It's not enough to just change the light bulbs to LED. We need to do much more than that. But certain CO2 emission sources are very hard to get rid of. It looks like we will still have emissions remaining for decades to come. So if the world can't get to zero, is that the end of the story? Is the 1.5 degrees Celsius target already out of reach? No. Science says we can still achieve net zero CO2 emissions. And net zero means that any unreduced emissions are balanced by the same amount of negative emissions or simply carbon removal. Remove the rest. But how would that work? To produce negative emissions, we need to take the CO2 we've emitted back out of the atmosphere and store it permanently. This is called carbon dioxide removal, CDR, or simply carbon removal. There are natural and technical approaches to remove carbon, growing a forest on previously woodless land, for example, or filtering CO2 directly from ambient air and storing it in rock formations deep underground. Climate scientists expect it will take billions of tons of negative emissions to stay on the net zero path until 2050. The path that can keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that amount keeps increasing the longer we wait to take serious action. The problem is that carbon removal approaches aren't deployed at scale yet. The carbon removal industry is getting ready to emerge. So how can companies and individuals help to get the world to net zero by 2050? We can do so by reducing our emissions as much and as fast as possible, for example, cutting down on flying. Without reducing emissions, net zero is not possible. While doing our best to reduce our emissions, one option is to use so-called carbon offsets. That way, we pay others to avoid their emissions in our stead. But with 1 ton emitted by us and 1 ton avoided elsewhere, there is still 1 ton emitted to the atmosphere. So this will never be enough to reach net zero. We need to go further than that and start balancing our emissions with carbon removal. For each ton we emit, another ton must be removed and stored right away. By first doing our best to reduce emissions, then removing the rest, we can do our part to help get the world to net zero by 2050. Removing CO2 is currently a lot more expensive than reducing most CO2 emissions or conventional carbon offsetting. But actually, it's also good that carbon removal comes at a cost. It puts a price on carbon, and it gives us a good incentive to first reduce our emissions wherever possible before removing them. At Swiss Re, we understand risks, and we're serious about making the world more resilient. In 2019, Swiss Re committed to net zero emissions from all our insurance offerings and investments by 2050. For our own operations, we've committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as much and as fast as possible and compensate the remaining emissions with 100% carbon removal as early as 2030. As a global reinsurer, we can play a key role in advancing the net zero transition. So together, let's do our best. Remove the rest.